Welcome back as we continue our discussion on understanding the fire element. This is part 2. If you have not watched part 1, please stop this video, go back and watch part 1. As we continue, again, this is Dr. Hollis, Executive Director here at the International Institute of Natural Wellness Education, and I again remind you that by proceeding you agree to the following terms of use, including that all information and statements provided here have not been evaluated by the Food and Drug Administration, are not intended to diagnose, prevent, treat, or cure any disease, are for informational purposes only, and by proceeding you agree to not to attempt to apply any of these principles or practices outlined herein unless you are otherwise licensed to do so. We remind you, for those that are joining us and just auditing this class, mind you that this is a part of our Master Herbology and Advanced Nutrition program, and we invite you to look at our program online at knowyourwellness.org or call us with any program-related questions at 208-899-2712. I specify program-related questions because, again, we are unable to answer, and we do not even attempt to answer medical questions by email, by phone, by YouTube post. So these are provided for so you can understand a little of what we teach here, but we again encourage you, find a formal program. Don't expect to understand something as in-depth as wellness and form and function of the body off of a simple few videos. Please consider being a part of a formal program. If it's not ours, then someone else's. So as we continue, on the break I was talking with one of the people here in the studio, and I thought it was interesting. We were just talking about this point I want to reiterate on how important it is to understand elements. I was talking about leaders, and I made the point of how many people, or how often, whether you're a fire element or not, you're in a leadership position or you're doing something like that, and you feel burnt out. You feel out of fire energy. The thing that's so common in our society is we just say we got to push harder. Don't be distracted. You just got to push harder and push harder, which then gets people more and more of a deficiency. They become more apathetic and flat feeling and joyless and shut down and withdrawn, and it just kind of spirals out. And then they might naturally try to do a different project to rediscover the childlike wonder like we discussed down here, and they get out a different project, but then they think to themselves, or somebody around them says, no, don't start that until you've finished doing what you're supposed to. So often we fight the natural tendencies that are our personality. And as you start to understand these things, as you use them more and more, it'll become very apparent at how the body functions. So then, when you are out of fire energy, instead of pushing and saying you just need more, you know how if anybody who's been on a camping trip knows, when the fire dies down, you don't just blow harder, because when a fire is big, you blow on it, you push it, and it goes big. But when it's about running out, you blow on it and it's just out. So you've got to discover other areas and other ways to build that fire. So I just want to point out again how important it is to really understand all of these elements. So here we're jumping into the second part on our discussion, and we're going to use the 5-element chart here a little more. Now, I've went ahead, you guys have this in front of you, but the one you have does not have the colors highlighted. So go ahead and color those for your benefit if you would like. No, we don't have a color version available. This is just for the lecture, so I'm sorry, you have to actually do the legwork and color code them as you deem necessary. But there's a couple of things I want to point out here. There is, as you can see, the purple, or I think it's probably shows up, maybe pink, I don't know, probably a purple on yours, tissue, the number 1 and 2, 7, 13, and 14. Those are all things that become apparent when that element is out of balance. The green ones are useful for balancing the element. See the green ones? 5, taste, is useful for balancing the element. Again, we come up to here. What's the taste for fire? It's bitter. Now, when we came over here and talked about ways to balance, do you notice we talked about, bitter leaves, radicchio, dandelion, so there's some crossover there that you start to understand. It's really that bitter flavor. So that's why we did them green. They're go. Green is go. They balance. Joy and excitement. We just got through talking about that. Summertime. What is summertime? It's out there. It's doing things. It's active. That's really good for somebody that's trying to balance that fire element. Growing things. Oh, we're going to talk about why growing things, which actually ties into the wood element and the earth element, which surround the fire. So that's really where that ties into. And then protein, and properly metabolizing protein, a real big thing. So then we talk about, so again, the purples are noticeable when it's out of balance. The greens are green as go. They help balance it. The yellows are a little bit unrelated. We'll talk about those, but finger sound, environment, and the muscles aren't exactly, they're just a little unrelated to, not unrelated, they're not in one of those two categories. But before I jump in, I want to point out number 11. It's its own color. Don't know what that shows up on your screen. There are two things that are not on this chart that also are very useful when assessing an element. So a dominant element. So the face is kind of pointed out, pointed angular. That's talked about. But if you notice up here, do you see each element there is a shape right there? This shape right here. That's what that is. That is the face shape commonly for someone that is a dominant fire element. So that's what you'll see these shapes all throughout the chart are. Okay, so be aware of that. The second thing is number 11, the stress response. This is really, really useful. Now, anybody that's really out of fire could potentially, that's why we don't list it under dominant element, could potentially have that stress response. If you're really out of fire and you're being pushed really hard, you're going to reach a fall apart point. But we see that really common with fires. They go and go and go and go and then just fall apart. That is their stress response most naturally. So those two things, this number 11 and the face shape, are, I just wanted to point out because they're on this chart, but it's useful to understand them. Okay? So be aware of that. So now let's talk about understanding this organ system. Now this lecture, you've already been through a lecture that talked about the interactions of all of these elements. So we're not going to go into an in-depth discussion on the interactions of balancing, key element, cascading element, operator elements. You've been through that. You understand that. This point in this series of e-learning modules is to give you a better understanding of what the fire element is. So the small intestine and the heart are the yin and yang. You see right over here, yin and yang organ systems. So that's going to be for the yin are all the inside. So heart, spleen, lung, kidney, liver, yin, soft, wet side of the. Now I always think of this, the way I remember it is yang is the more masculine, strong. I think of it as protecting the vital organs on the inside, the heart and liver and kidneys. And the outside organs, the yang organs, are protecting the vital organs on the inside. That's just how I think of it in my mind, just to remember it. But think of it however you would like. So as we look at the chart here, now these are times of day. Again, we're not going to use that heavily in this lecture, but you understand that's times of day when there's detox and extra things happening. Sometimes in assessment, and we'll talk about later times if people are waking up at a certain time or having an imbalance going on at a certain time of day, we might look at when that time is happening and see if it doesn't coincide with. And again, it's just an indicator, something to ponder on. So let's talk about this system. So we talked about fall apart. Anybody who's known a fire, that is them. I mean, they go and go and go and then fall apart. And now, that doesn't mean it's good, it's bad, it's understanding. So that just means if you are a fire or if you know somebody that is, you help them recognize that stress point before they fall apart, ideally, and then you come to this list and you help them, eat the foods, take the herbs. We haven't talked, there's a whole separate one where we talk on 5-element herbs. You haven't done that lecture, but we will talk also about herbs to help balance. But this lecture is just about understanding. So you might help them laugh, communicate. If they're a fire person and you're working with them and they're about to fall apart, get them out of the moment. Help, talk to them. Let them talk it out. Let them smile, laugh. Take a break. That's why you go do something different and come back. That works really well for fires. Now let's talk about things, the green on this. So number 5, number 8, 9, 10, and 12. Those are all things that are useful for balancing. So again, I've talked about the joy and excitement. Those are good things if this person's out of balance. Bitter foods, but not just the greens. This would be other bitters. Things that are in that category of bitters are going to be helpful. And so all of those are really good. Growing things. Don't think of growing as planting. Okay, that's a common misconception. We think that we're trying to make all the fires gardeners. It's not about growing. It can, and it is very common that they like to, have a garden, have an herb garden, or a big garden, or a greenhouse. Those are all common things. But I want you to understand when we're talking about this point right here, we're talking about growing anything. Growing a new skill, a new hobby, developing something. It's about growing. It's not about just growing plants. It's growing in some other area than what they're out of balance on. Because we're talking about the green ones. We're talking about the balancing because there's an out of balance. So when they're out of balance, give them another area to grow. That's what you do with a fire, a campfire. When it starts to go out, you don't just blow on it more. You give it something else so that it can grow. Then it'll often, the coals that you were trying to nurture, if you put another piece of wood on, that other piece of wood takes fire, it rebuilds that fire, gets the fire energy back. Then the coals that you were busy blowing and trying to get going, they all of a sudden come right back. So again, think of it as growing anything. Just help them grow. Don't push them. Give them an outlet like you would putting a stick on a fire. Okay, we talked about the bitter foods, and often that's something that is joy and excitement. I can't stress that enough. Passion. I mean, fires are not hard to motivate when you understand what motivates them. Passion, excitement, new area to grow, love new projects. The trick is getting to balance that so you can use those things to help them also finish the projects that they're working on. Now, the last one here, protein. This is what they metabolize. Is going to be protein. So protein, if you've been through the digestion modules, you know that in the stomach, their acid does 3 major things: breaks mineral bonds, protein bonds, and kills pathogenic organisms. It has a 4th function of opening the pyloric valve, as you know, but its main function is killing pathogenic organisms and breaking mineral bonds and breaking protein bonds. And then, of course, the release of protease in to start that process. But that's what happens in the stomach. Then the pyloric valve opens and it goes into the small intestine where the actual metabolism of those proteins takes place. So people that have an imbalance in the fire element, so number 12 I put under balancing, not as much as because it tells you what to balance, but because it helps remind you of something that might need balancing. And what I mean by that is if their fire element is out of balance, whether they're a dominant fire or not, you want to make sure that they're properly metabolizing protein, because that can really commonly happen. So it might not be enough to have a broad spectrum food enzyme. You might need to also look at either triggering acid release by the proton pumps, which would be doing something like the vinegars or fermented foods or kefirs and fermented pickles. You've seen all the videos we have on that. So those would trigger the release of acid, or you may actually need to supplement betaine hydrochloride to make sure that there's enough stomach acid to break mineral bonds, protein bonds, and kill pathogenic organisms. And you also likewise may not be able to just use a broad spectrum protein or enzyme, digestive enzyme. You might have to use something that's specific to the enzyme, which is, or you should know. If not, go back and watch those digestive lectures because you should know that. Protease. So you might want to do a stronger protease. Again, just something to watch for because you know that protein is responsible in this fire element, and if it's out of balance, keep an eye on it. Just like you would with keeping an eye on the small intestine. reproduction. It's no surprise that we've talked several times about how fires have the passion and delight in intimacy, very passionate people. And as such, that's because that's the element that deals with reproduction. So be it over or under, when you see an imbalance in reproduction, that's where it comes to. Now, this is important to understand. We commonly I guess I can't say I commonly hear it out there. I don't look at it like that. Most medical community, when they look at something like male reproductive imbalance, the most commonly being erectile dysfunction, they're going to look at it as a cardiovascular function, a function of the blood vessels that cause the erection to allow for reproduction. Sometimes people look at it as a hormone imbalance, which often, if you understand erectile dysfunction, it's usually not a lack of hormones, it's a lack of this energy, fire element. So I wouldn't say it's a cardiovascular problem. I would say it's a low fire energy. Okay, so that's what I would look at. But again, I'm not looking at just that symptom, but I would look at fire energy, anything reproduction. Think of a woman's cycle also has a heavy tie to blood. Again, we would call it cardiovascular in the medical world, but just the heart or circulation, blood, menstruation. So both of these have a heavy tie to blood, reproductive organs. The triple warmer will do whole lectures on what that ties to. It's a traditional Chinese medical reference to some meridian vessel systems that we'll talk about. But just think of it as reproduction, small intestine, heart. So going back over here, I want to talk about the yellow points. Now, we're not going to talk about number 3 too much in this series of lectures. It's the finger associated, which I know some of you are turning your head cockeyes and saying, finger, what are you talking about? Well, when we talk about different acupressure techniques, or for those of you that have done things like Djinn Shinjitsu, which is a manual therapy, you're going to use different fingers for different things. However, there is another function that can be. You can actually do it for your own balancing, where you hold a finger when you're trying to get out of balance. So if you knew, for example, if we look at the emotions, 7 and 8 are emotions associated with fire. So you want to get the joy and excitement. That would be a balance of fire. However, when you get out of balance, you feel sorrow. Remember, if we go back to this, when we're out of balance, sorrow is going to be a real common one. Where's our chart here? So as we look at the deficiencies, apathy, joyless, sorrow, shutdown, all of those things. So if you're feeling those, especially not as much in a chronic case, I don't suggest this for somebody that may be chronically fire, but if you're in a moment where you've just had something traumatic happen, or I even know in manual therapies, we don't teach it in our programs, but there's programs that teach, like Djinn Shinjitsu, that teach how to use that in acute cases where somebody may be having an acute problem in their cardiovascular system, and you actually hold that little finger to help balance that meridian vessel system that deals with all of those organ systems. If that, you should have been through the meridian vessel system lecture that goes through all of those, so you know all of the 12 meridian vessel systems. Yes, I know there's 5 elements, a yin and yang, that only seems 10, but then there are 2 others that we went over in that. So the 12 plus the 2 confluent, and then the ones beyond that. So go back through that. I'm not going to, I'd start into that and I'd spend another 10 minutes going into that. But again, you remember that goes down that little finger. So when would I use this? Well, aside from doing manual therapies, it's nice to know, because you sometimes will see children, maybe they're sucking on their last 2 fingers. Watch the mannerisms. Sometimes that's an indicator that they might be feeling sorrow. Or if they're, if we scroll down here, if they were sucking on their last 2 fingers, that would be ring finger, which would be, if you look at the grief. So grief and sorrow. Wow, those go really hand in hand. As you can see, number 7, I just so you make sure I understand that I'm looking at number 3 right here. Okay, whoop. That didn't work. Let's try that circling again on this. So number 3 right here. And then along with it, I'm looking at that. Oh, that just is not going to work for me today. So I'll just go like this. You guys get what I'm talking about. Number 3, little finger. The emotion that's would be out of balance would be number 7. Okay, to see how those two work together. So that deals with the emotion. The little finger would be sorrow. So when you see children that are sucking on their pinky and their ring finger, and that's the fingers they suck on, it's often the sorrow, which would be here. And then if we come down to this element down here, the metal air element, you can see that's the ring finger right there, and the emotion being grief. So often you'll see grief and sorrow. Usually I hold those together. So I will use this if in a traumatic situation, and sometimes you'll notice people doing it without even realizing it. They're in a traumatic situation and they will grasp their index, their pinky and ring finger and squeeze really tight. It's a temporary kind of grounding effect that helps you in that state where you're going through sorrow and grief. Okay, so it's really a useful thing to use if you're doing meditation or guided imagery or self-affirmations. You might also use that where you would hold. Now, some people always ask, well, which do I hold, with my right hand or my left hand? Again, that gets in a little to what you're feeling. The yin organ would be your left. That's going to be your heart. So if it's truly sorrow in your heart and grief in your heart, you would hold your left fingers with your right hand. The other one might be yang. You could look at it from a male-female perspective. If it's yin and heart from a feminine standpoint, you would hold the left. From a masculine standpoint, you'd hold the right. We could talk for another hour on which hand to use, and as we get more into meridian vessels, you'll understand it more. But I just wanted to point out that's what that finger is. Now, laughing, I don't have to explain that to you. You've heard me talk. That is the natural sound for heart. Now, the reason I didn't put it green, it probably could be put green because it is useful in balancing. Sure is. But I wanted to point out sometimes you can also use the number 4, the sound, to help identify people's dominant elements. So I could have made it pink like number 11. Because again, somebody that laughs a lot, laughs really easy, that's a natural sound. That's why I left it yellow, because it really crosses over several boundaries. Because laughing is natural for somebody that has a lot of fire energy. If you're using to balance it, you can balance it by getting them to laugh. So now the last 2 on our list here that I don't want to forget to go over is 15 and 16. These are the muscles, the yin and yang. So if I scroll back down here to my key, right here, as you can see, the 15 is the yang organs, so that are the yang muscles, and 16 is the yin muscles. So feminine and masculine, yin and yang, hot and dry, hot and dry, or cold and wet, depending on how you're looking at it. You're going to go yin and yang. Now, the reason I don't put those as a pink ones or purple ones, I could put them as purple because somebody could say, well, you use those to assess which system is out of balance. True. When there is an energy system balance, if somebody is truly out of balance fire, those muscles are going to be getting less innervated energy and have the potential, just like when we talked on this chart, there's the potential for pathology problems there. However, I don't color them purple because we live in a modern society that, in my opinion, has far more traumatic injuries than any society that has ever existed. Now, sure, back in the day, trees fell on people when they were logging and different things. But with car wrecks and the competitive sports and the different things we do, to me, in my experience, I think we have a much increased level of musculoskeletal imbalances. So I do not use 15 and 16 as an assessment for what is out of balance. because it could be completely unrelated. It could happen that people are doing a repetitive job. It could be that they've been in an accident, they've been in an injury. It could be often, especially on some of these, it's commonly because people are sitting all day. I mean, you look over here at the wood element, or it's because they're hunched forward in their computer. So much of our modern society deals or results in musculoskeletal imbalances that I want you to be aware of those, but I don't want you to use those as an assessment. So how do you use them? When you know somebody has an out of balance fire element, be it that they're a dominant fire and they've used up all their fire energy, or that's something they use a lot for their job, and whatever the reason, they're just out of that fire energy, you're going to want to watch that they also don't have musculoskeletal problems in those areas. Now, again, we're not teaching, extensive manual therapies here, but it may be that you recommend they go get a massage. You just want to be aware of it. Remember, you're working with them as their master herbalist, advanced nutrition consultant. You're the one working with it. So even if you're not going to be providing those manual therapies, it's something you should watch for, ask them about, and if there's a problem, properly refer out, or if you also have modalities that allow you to work on that, because I know a lot of you are also massage therapists or other manual therapists, then you might use that in such. So really, again, I just want you to be aware of it. So that kind of ties in, it kind of wraps up how to use this chart for all things related to the heart. So if this is the first time, not the heart, excuse me, the fire element. So please take the time to go through each of these. If this is your first or your fifth, make sure you go through all the elements. So much of this starts to make sense as you go through all the elements. So to wrap up again, the yellow, so the numbers 3, 4, 6, 15, and 16, those are ones that I'm aware of. They don't necessarily balance, or they're not necessarily always a problem when they're out of balance. The purples, I really notice when they're out of balance. So somebody that has, and I didn't talk too much on those, somebody that has a dominant fire element that's out of balance, or even not dominant, just the fire element is out of balance, you're going to see more blood vessel problems. Tongue is the sense organ that they're going to have. Now that doesn't apply as much. We don't, have accurate testing for tastes. But when you get into some of the others, like eyes and hearing and some of those, it really can be a good indicator of an out-of-balance system. Sorrow being number 7 here, the emotion, when you listen to them and all they talk about is they're just sad about this and sad about that, it really becomes obvious that that element is what's out of balance. And then participation, as we go down to 13 and 14, let me scroll down here, fluid secretion. Again, if that system is out of balance, who's ever known a fire that was out of balance and sweat, had a lot of sweat, a lot of precipitation? And again, who's known a redhead that had complexion problems? The fire was out of balance. Fires, the reason I keep going back to redheads, that's a good example here, because redheads are often dominant fire element. Not always. But again, all of those things might be indicators, not of a dominant element. Remember, I'm not telling you it's an indicator of a dominant element. I'm telling you the purples, 1, 2, 7, 13, and 14 are indicators of what could be out of balance. Number 11 and the shape that we have over here are common indicators of a dominant element. The green ones, so 5, 8, 9, 10, 13, and 12, those are useful when balancing. And then the yellows are just things to be aware of. So I hope this gives you a better understanding of what to look for, what all the systems are involved. And stay tuned with us, and we'll go through all the different elements. Thank you. And on behalf of the International Institute of Natural Wellness Education, I am honored to have you. We are honored to have you a part of the Master Herbology and Advanced Nutrition program. And for those that are not already a part of that, we remind you to visit us online at knowyourwellness.org. Thank you so much.